My name is Thomas. I am 64 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades pouring concrete, reading blueprints, and coming home with calloused hands to a woman who loved me anyway. My wife, Carol, passed away 3 years ago from a quiet illness that gave us just enough time to say everything we needed to say to each other. I am grateful for that. Not every man gets that kind of goodbye. After she was gone, I did what I always do. I kept moving. I finished the projects on my desk. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays. I called my son every Sunday evening, even when the calls were short, even when he seemed distracted, even when I could hear a television in the background and knew I was interrupting something he considered more important. I told myself that was fine. Young men have their lives. I understood that. What I did not understand, what I never could have prepared myself for, was the morning I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and read a formal payment request for $215,000. My name was printed at the top as the responsible party. The line items included a wedding venue, catering for 300 guests, a photography package, floral arrangements, a rehearsal dinner, a honeymoon in the Maldives, and something listed simply as bridal party coordination fees. At the bottom, in my son's handwriting, was a short note. It said, "Dad, I know this is a lot to ask, but you always said family comes first. This is your chance to prove it." What the note did not mention, what he had told me on the phone just 11 days earlier, was that I was not invited to the wedding. I sat there for a long time. Not because I was confused. I understood exactly what was happening. I sat there because I wanted to make sure that when I finally stood up and took action, I did it with a clear head and clean hands. That is something Carol always said about me. She said, "Thomas, you never act angry. You act decided." I was very decided that morning. Let me go back to the beginning, because this story did not start with a bill. It started the way most painful things do, gradually. Nathan was our only child. Carol and I had tried for more, but it was not meant to be, and so we poured everything into him. Not in a smothering way, I want to be clear about that. We raised him to be independent. I taught him how to change a tire when he was 14. I made him get a summer job at 16 even though we did not need the money. When he went to college in another state, I did not call every day. I trusted him. He grew into a good man. Hardworking, decent, thoughtful in the way that young people sometimes are when their parents have modeled it for them. He called me every Sunday without fail, even through college, even through his first job, even through his first apartment. For a long time, those Sunday calls were the thing I looked forward to most each week. Then he met Serena. I want to be fair. First impressions are not always reliable, and I know that a father can sometimes look at the woman his son loves and see a threat where there is none. I tried very hard to keep that in mind when Nathan brought Serena home for the first time, about 2.5 years ago now. She was beautiful in a very deliberate way, the kind of beautiful that requires maintenance and attention and a certain awareness of being observed at all times. She shook my hand firmly and smiled at me with her whole face, and for about 10 minutes I thought, well, maybe I had been too quick to feel uneasy. Then she looked around my living room and said, very pleasantly, "Nathan told me you built this house yourself. That must have been so much work." And the way she said so much work, I cannot fully explain it. But there was something underneath those words that sounded less like admiration and more like pity, like she was complimenting a child's drawing. I let it go. People say awkward things when they are nervous, but over the following months, I noticed things. The Sunday calls got shorter. Nathan started saying things like, "We're thinking about doing things a little differently going forward, and Serena feels like it's important to build our own traditions." Nothing alarming on its own, but the frequency of it, the way the language started to feel like it belonged to someone else, that bothered me. The real shift came about 14 months ago. Nathan called me on a Tuesday, which was unusual, and told me that Serena's family had offered to help them buy a house in a neighborhood on the north side of the city. A nice neighborhood. He was excited. I was happy for him. Then he said, very carefully, "Her parents are a little particular about things, Dad. They have a certain way they do things. I just want you to know going in." I asked him what that meant. He said it meant that when I came to visit, it might be better to call ahead, that Serena liked the house to be a certain way when guests arrived, that her parents would be coming by often, and they were, and here he paused, used to a particular social environment. I told him I understood. I did not tell him what I was thinking, which was that I had been in that boy's delivery room, that I had stayed up through 3 nights when he had pneumonia at age 7, that I had driven 400 miles one February to help him move out of an apartment after a bad breakup, and that calling ahead to avoid inconveniencing his fiancée's sense of social order was not something I should have to negotiate. But I called ahead. Every single time. The engagement was announced at a dinner I was invited to barely. Nathan called me 4 days before to say there would be a small family gathering and that I should come. When I arrived, Serena's family was already there. Her father, Gerald, was a tall man with the handshake of someone who wants you to know he works out. Her mother, Patricia, spoke to me exactly twice the entire evening, both times to say something nice about the food. Serena's 2 sisters treated me with the polite indifference of people who had been briefed on my existence but not particularly interested in the details. Nathan announced the engagement after dinner. Everyone applauded. Serena cried in a photogenic way. I hugged my son and told him I loved him, and he hugged me back, and for just a moment it felt like everything was going to be fine. On the drive home, I told myself to stop looking for problems. I told myself that Carol would have handled this better than me, would have found a way to charm Serena, to win over Gerald and Patricia, to make herself indispensable in a way that did not feel like effort. I missed her very much that night. The planning began almost immediately. I was not included in most of it, which I accepted. Serena had very specific ideas about the wedding, and from what Nathan described, those ideas involved a venue that required a 12-month booking, a catering company that flew in a consultant from out of state, and a honeymoon package that a travel agent described as ultra-luxury immersive. I smiled and nodded during the Sunday calls, and did not ask about costs because it was not my place to ask. Then, 7 months into the engagement, Nathan called me on a Wednesday evening and asked if we could talk. He told me that the wedding was going to be more expensive than they had originally planned. He said that Serena's family had certain expectations about the event, and that meeting those expectations required a budget that was beyond what the 2 of them could manage on their own. He said that Gerald and Patricia had agreed to contribute a portion, but that there was still a significant gap. I asked him what he was asking me. He said he was hoping I could help cover the rest. I asked him how much. There was a pause. Then he said $215,000. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I asked him, as calmly as I could, whether he understood what he was asking. I am a retired contractor. I live comfortably. I am not wealthy. Carol and I saved carefully for 35 years, and that savings is what I live on now, what I was hoping to leave to Nathan one day, and what $215,000 would take a very large piece out of. Nathan said he understood. He said he was sorry to ask. He said it was important to Serena. He said her family had a reputation to maintain. I told him I would think about it. I did think about it. For about 2 weeks, I thought about almost nothing else. I made a list of what I could genuinely afford without compromising my financial security. I called my accountant, a man named Roy, who has been doing my taxes for 20 years and who I trust completely. Roy looked at my assets, my monthly income, my projected needs, and told me that contributing more than $40,000 would put me in a genuinely difficult position by the time I reached 70. I called Nathan back and told him that $40,000 was what I could offer. I told him I was proud of him and that I wanted the wedding to be wonderful. I told him the money was a gift, not a loan, no strings attached. He went quiet. Then he said he would have to talk to Serena. 3 days later, I received a text, not a call, a text that said, "Serena thinks it would be better if you didn't come to the ceremony. She says having both families there is going to be complicated, and her parents really need to focus. You can come to the reception." I read that text 4 times. Then I called Nathan. He did not answer. I called again the next morning. He answered and told me, in a voice that sounded like he was reading from a script, that the ceremony was going to be very intimate, that Serena's side had a large, extended family, and that it was simply a matter of logistics. I asked him directly, "Was this about the money?" He said no. He said it was about what Serena needed. I told him I loved him. I told him I would respect his decision. And then I said, very clearly, that he should understand that my $40,000 offer was contingent on being a full participant in my son's wedding day, and that if I was not welcome at the ceremony, the offer was no longer on the table. He said he understood. I assumed that was the end of it. 11 days later, I received the envelope in the mail, $215,000, itemized, with my name at the top as the responsible party, the note in Nathan's handwriting. Family comes first. I sat with it for a long time. Then I called Roy. Roy is the kind of man who has seen everything and is surprised by very little. But when I read him the line items over the phone, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thomas, I want you to do me a favor. Before you respond to this, let me make a couple of calls. Roy has connections in the financial and legal community that I do not have. I did not ask him to do anything improper. I just told him that if there was anything he could find out through legitimate channels about Serena's family, Gerald and Patricia, their financial standing, anything publicly available, I would appreciate knowing it before I made any decisions." He called me back 4 days later. What he told me was this: Gerald and Patricia's business, a mid-size real estate development company, had filed for a significant restructuring 18 months ago. They were not bankrupt, but they were also very far from the old money image they projected. The house Serena grew up in was mortgaged to a degree that would have surprised most people who attended their dinner parties. The cars, the clothes, the country club membership, all of it maintained on credit and appearance. Roy also told me something else. He had spoken to a colleague who knew someone at the venue where the wedding was booked. The deposit on the venue, a substantial one, had been paid with a check that had initially bounced. It was covered 3 days later, but it had bounced. So, the family, with certain expectations and a reputation to maintain, was, in the most practical sense, trying to fund a performance they could not afford. And the gap they needed filled $215,000 was not supplemental. It was foundational. Without it, there likely was no wedding. Not the wedding they had planned anyway. I want to tell you something about how I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I was not angry. I want to be careful to say that clearly, because anger would have been understandable and anger would have been useless. What I felt was something more like a very deep sadness, and underneath that, a clarity I had not had in months. My son was not a bad person. I believed that then and I believe it now. But he was a young man who had fallen in love with a woman who came with an entire architecture of expectation. And somewhere in the process of trying to meet those expectations, he had lost sight of something important. He had stopped being Nathan, my son, and started being Nathan, the future son-in-law of Gerald and Patricia, and those were two very different men with very different obligations. I also thought about Carol. I thought about what she would have done, and I think she would have done exactly what I decided to do. I wrote Nathan a letter, a real letter, on paper, the way I was taught. I told him that I loved him without condition. I told him that I had spent 30 years building something alongside his mother so that he would have security and options and a foundation to stand on. I told him I was proud of who he had become, and that I trusted he would find his way back to himself. And then I told him, clearly and without cruelty, that I would not be paying the bill. I told him that I had looked into the financial situation carefully, and that the wedding as planned was built on a foundation that was not what it appeared to be. I told him that I was available to talk, any time, any day, and that my door was always open. But that writing a check for $215,000 to be excluded from my own son's wedding ceremony while doing it was not something I was willing to do. I told him that if he wanted to get married, I would happily contribute $40,000 toward a wedding I was genuinely welcome at. A smaller wedding. A real one. I sealed the envelope and mailed it that afternoon. You can imagine the response. Serena called me not Nathan. Serena, 3 days after the letter arrived. She was controlled, but barely. She told me that I was being selfish. She told me that this was the most important day of her life, and that my unwillingness to contribute was putting everything at risk. She said that Nathan had always talked about how supportive I was, and that my behavior now was a profound disappointment. I let her finish. Then I told her that I wished her well, that I hoped she and Nathan would build a happy life together, that I hoped one day she would be able to look back on this period and understand it differently. She hung up. Nathan called me the next evening. He was upset, not cold like Serena, but genuinely distressed in a way that I recognized as the voice he had when he was a teenager and something had gone wrong that he did not know how to fix. He asked me why I was doing this. He asked me if I understood what I was putting him through. I told him yes. I told him I understood exactly what I was putting him through, because I understood what he was already going through, and that the two things were not the same. He said, "Dad, Serena's family can't." And then he stopped. I waited. He said, "Things are more complicated than you know." I told him I knew more than he might think. There was a long silence. And then my son said something that broke my heart in the most necessary way possible. He said, "I didn't want to tell you that I couldn't be at the ceremony. That wasn't what I wanted." I said, "I know." He said, "She said it would make things easier, that her parents needed." I said, "Nathan, I know. What happened next took about 6 weeks, and I am not going to tell you it was clean or easy, because it was not. The wedding did not happen. Not the $215,000 version. Without my contribution, and without Gerald and Patricia able to cover the gap, the venue was lost. The caterer was released. The photographer was notified. Serena, to her credit or discredit depending on how you look at it, handled the unraveling with considerable fury directed at everyone except herself. Nathan moved out of the house on the north side of the city. He stayed with a friend from work for 3 weeks. He called me on a Sunday, the first Sunday call in almost 4 months, and we talked for 2 hours. He told me things that I will keep private because they are his story to tell, not mine. But I will say this. He was not the man I had raised somewhere in that house on the north side. He was a version of Nathan that had been slowly adjusted, like a piece of furniture moved 1 inch at a time until you look up and realize it is in an entirely different room. Coming back was not instant. It was a process. It required him to sit with some hard truths about choices he had made and things he had allowed to happen. I did not rush that process. I did not say I told you so. Not once. Not even when I wanted to. I just kept answering the phone. He told me, in one of those conversations, that when he had sent the bill, or rather, when he had signed and mailed the document that Serena had prepared, he had done it while telling himself it was just a formality, that I would understand. That family comes first, and I would see it that way. He said he had known, even as he dropped the envelope in the mailbox, that he was doing something wrong. I told him I appreciated him telling me that. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm really sorry." I told him that the apology was accepted completely, and that we did not need to carry it any further than that, and that if he wanted to come over on Sunday, I would make the chili his mother used to make in the fall. He came over on Sunday. He ate 2 bowls of chili. He looked like himself again, for the first time in a long time. I want to talk about the money for a moment, because I know that is the part of this story that people sometimes focus on, and I think it deserves a clear-eyed look. $215,000 is a number that sounds enormous, and it is. It is a number that represents, for me, approximately 4.5 years of careful retirement savings. It is not money I could have simply absorbed without consequence. Roy was very clear about that. But I also want to say this. The money was never really the point. The point was what the money would have purchased. Not a wedding. Weddings can be held in backyards, in parks, in church fellowship halls. The money would have purchased a performance, a demonstration of a status that did not exist, financed by a father who was not welcome to watch it happen. It would have said, in the clearest possible language, that I could be used without being valued, that my role in my son's life was to fund the version of himself that other people preferred. I was not willing to say that. Not for $215,000. Not for any amount. What I gave Nathan instead was $40,000, which he eventually put toward a down payment on a small apartment closer to me, where he lives now and where I visit on Sundays without calling ahead. That, to me, is a much better investment. There are things I have thought about in the months since all of this happened, late at night when the house is quiet and I am the kind of tired that does not quite tip over into sleep. I have thought about whether I could have done something earlier, whether there was a moment, some specific Sunday phone call, where a different set of words from me might have changed the trajectory of things. I do not think so. Some lessons cannot be taught. They can only be lived through and then recovered from. I have thought about Carol and what she would make of where things stand now. I think she would be glad that Nathan found his way back. I think she would be less interested in what he found his way back from, and more interested in what he is building now. That is the kind of woman she was. Forward-looking, not bitter, always more interested in what comes next than what went wrong. I have thought about Serena. I hold no particular anger toward her. People who build their identities around appearances are usually doing so because something underneath feels very precarious, and that is a hard way to live. I hope she finds something more solid to stand on. I hope Gerald and Patricia do too. And I have thought about Nathan, about the young man who used to call me every Sunday without fail, who worked a summer job at 16, who once drove through a snowstorm to make it home for his mother's birthday, because he said he had promised, and a promise was a promise. That young man is still there. I can hear him on Sunday evenings, when my son calls me on the phone, and we talk about ordinary things. His work, a book he read, a game we both watched. I can hear him in the way Nathan still says, "Thanks, Dad," at the end of a conversation. The way his voice has the particular quality it gets when he is relaxed and not performing for anyone. I am not a man who uses words like grateful lightly. My generation was taught that gratitude is demonstrated, not announced. But I will say this. I am grateful for the version of my life I am living right now. For the Sunday calls, for the chilly on fall afternoons, for the apartment that is close enough to visit and far enough to give him room to become whoever he is going to become. A man once told me, many years ago when I was a young contractor just starting out, that the most important thing you can build is not a structure but a reputation. He meant it professionally, but I have come to believe it applies to almost everything. The reputation you build with your children, for honesty, for consistency, for the kind of love that does not come with conditions or invoices, is the only structure that matters in the end. I stared at that bill for a long time the morning it arrived. I stared at the line items, and the dollar signs, and the note in my son's handwriting, and I smiled, not coldly the way I had once described, but with something closer to certainty. I knew what I was worth. I knew what I was willing to do, and I knew, with the particular confidence that comes from 64 years of building things that last, that no amount of money is worth the cost of forgetting either one. That is not a lesson I could teach my son by writing a check. It is a lesson he had to learn by watching me not write one.